Good evening, everyone. My name's Duncan Petrie. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, which forms part of the university's Cantor Modern Art Lecture Series. This lecture series provides us with the time to reflect on and celebrate the social, economic, and cultural impacts of modern art today, and the innovations that are continuously taking place. Tonight's event, Curating Modern Art Today, is the 5th event in the Cantor Modern Art series and the 13th of the overall Cantor Lectures, which have been generously supported by the former Vice-Chancellor, Professor Brian Cantor, who is with us this evening. I'm delighted to introduce Dr Nicholas Cullinan OBE, Director of the British Museum, whose life and career journey we'll learn more about throughout this evening. He's been critically acclaimed for his contemporary interventions at the British Museum and his innovative and landmark transformation of the National Portrait Gallery. Nicholas started his role at the British Museum in June 2024, after having been a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Tate Modern in London. At each of these internationally recognised institutions, his work has reflected and prioritised innovation, collaboration and public engagement. He was awarded an OBE for services to the arts in the 2024 King's New Year's Honours List. Welcome, Nicholas. And I'm also delighted to introduce Dr James Boaden, Senior Lecturer in Modern Contemporary Art at the University of York. James will be interviewing Nicholas tonight and will allow us to tune into the questions of modern art throughout his complex understanding of modern art in today's world. Welcome, James, and I'm now going to pass things over to you. Thank you very much.
So I guess it probably seems a little perverse that we would ask the director of the British Museum to come and talk about contemporary curating. And it's probably good to say that this has taken quite a long time to come to fruition. And when we first asked Nick to come here, he was still the director of the National Portrait Gallery. But hopefully what we're going to talk about tonight is some sort of milestones, I guess, in terms of your career as a curator and also as a museum director at the MPG, and think a little bit about how some of those practices may well feed into what you're doing now. Mm-hmm. I guess I actually wanted to start with the photograph that's on screen now, which is one of your official portraits for your job now as director of the British Museum. And I guess it kind of draws attention to objects, to the Portland vase, to this object that you've often talked about as being a favourite. And I guess I'm kind of interested in what the difference is between being a museum director and being a curator. I mean, how do those things feed into one another?
Yeah, good question. So, well, there's in a way, there's two different contexts for this photograph. So when I started at the British Museum last summer, you sort of have to have a portrait or a press photo so they can use it for different things. And I just didn't want to do the usual kind of museum director photo where you stand with your arms folded and you look serious. And I'd been working on an exhibition with Tim Walker, who took the photograph, who's a great photographer, for the National Portrait Gallery, which I can say now because it's been announced. It's going to be next autumn, and it's called Fairyland, and it's like a sort of queer history of the UK. And we began the projects back in like 2020, and Tim's been taking photographs of lots of different queer sitters, including Miriam Margolis. You may have seen those images that were in Vogue a couple of years ago where she has like Chelsea buns. So anyway, so when they asked if I would have an official portrait, I asked Tim if he would do it. So that's the beginning. And then when we were thinking about the setup, again, we wanted to do something that would be a little bit different and to think about the museum. And at that point, I mean, this is actually not the original Portland vase, which is the very beautiful Roman glass vase that we have in the collection. This is the Wedgwood copy, which is also very important, the fact that Josiah Wedgwood was able to make this mass-produced version of the Portland vase in the 18th century. And so we sort of managed to actually borrow this to do the photo. But the question wasn't about that. The question was about...
The question was about how a curator becomes a director, I guess.
I mean, I suppose it's fairly common.
Yeah, it is. And that's what I find interesting, because what I hope we'll talk about is kind of what skills there are that are shared between the two practices.
Well, I suppose the main skill that's essential, I think, obviously for a good curator and hopefully for a good museum director, is a love of objects, or a love of the collection, or a love of working with artists, if that's part of your remit. And I think, all the other skills, whether I don't have any background in financial management or audit and risk, or all of the many, many joyful committees that I now happily spend most of my working life in. But you can acquire those skills. But I think what you can't acquire is a knowledge and a love of what the essence of the museum is about, which is really, most museums are about art or artists or objects. And I do think that if a good director has that as the genesis of their interest in museums, all the other skills you can acquire.
Yeah. So, because we're here tonight in Yorkshire, I thought that we'd start really with Yorkshire. So what we're looking at here is one of Martin Parr's photographs of Hebden Bridge, probably, I think, from Hebdenstall, from above. Mm-hmm. Lots of people here will be aware of Hebden Bridge, may well have been there. It's where you spent most of your time growing up. Mm. And I'm just kind of interested in what kind of perspective you think that gives you actually on running a museum.
Well, maybe it makes you thrifty. I don't know. Well, so if any of you know Hebden Bridge, or I won't sort of go into a huge discussion about it, but obviously it's a small but very interesting village in West Yorkshire. But it's a small village, and and I grew up not even in the village itself. I kind of grew up in the countryside around. So I grew up in a pretty rural environment. I was taught at home. I didn't go to school. So I have kind of a different background maybe than a lot of other people. And yeah, it's interesting, like if you were to draw a line between my background, childhood upbringing, and what I do now, there's not an obvious kind of trajectory, I would say. And in some ways, they're almost like diametrically opposed, because I didn't go to school, my education was quite freeform. So it wasn't very structured, which was great. But it's kind of the opposite of my life now, having two colleagues who are here with me from the museum, whose job it is to kind of structure every minute of my day. Maybe they could attest to this, having left a mark. But I don't know. Yeah, they're like very different chapters, but in a way, maybe coming from a small rural community, I guess it's given me maybe a different perspective on things, and maybe that's been quite useful, and maybe I kind of kept some of my powder dry to then therefore become very structured in my day-to-day life as I am now.
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting sometimes when you're interviewed and you're always thinking actually about the way in which exhibitions might be perceived quite far away from London.
Yeah.
And at the MPG, where you lent a lot of works to regional collections, including the Bronte portraits to Haworth, which is not so far away from Hebden Bridge, it strikes me that actually this is kind of an important way of thinking about a national collection.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's very true. And maybe I don't even realize that, because to me it's kind of second nature. But yeah, the fact that I grew up in a small village in Yorkshire, we didn't get to go to London very often. I mean, occasionally, but it was expensive. So, those trips were very precious. But what I was used to more was, I mean, beyond just growing up in the countryside and in nature, going to places like the Bronte Parsonage, going to Manchester City Art Gallery, Leeds City Art Gallery. And so I suppose, when I'm thinking about things, especially about the kind of national responsibility of a national museum, whether it's the National Portrait Gallery or the British Museum, I'm always thinking about, okay, there's obviously, what we do in the building in London, and there's also international work, which especially for the British Museum is incredibly important. But there's really a national responsibility to share the collection, and not just to share the collection, but to make it possible for other organizations that are smaller and maybe don't have the infrastructure or the resources to borrow. I just came this afternoon from two museums in York that we have partnerships with, the Yorkshire Museum and the Army Museum. And both of those, are based on real partnership of making it possible for smaller organizations to be able to show their collection alongside maybe loans from other organizations.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something that is second nature to me. I mean, or first nature. It's not something I think about as a kind of nice to have, but maybe that is a bit different than other people's.
Yeah.
I suppose if you grew up in London, you maybe have a different perception. Nothing wrong with growing up in London, but yeah.
No, I would say so. So you left Heavenbridge at the age of, what, 18, 19, 20? Maybe?
Yeah, about that age, yeah.
To go to the Courtauld Institute of Art in London.
Where we met.
Where we met, and where you...
James and I have known each other 26 years, so...
Yeah, so I've got all the dirt. He's nervous.
Likewise.
So you stayed there for your BA, for your MA, and also for your PhD, and it's quite an interesting environment, I guess, because it's just art history, which is taught there. And I guess I was kind of interested that, whether you came to that place knowing that you wanted to work in museums.
No, I mean, I didn't really have a plan. And it's funny now when people, ask about my career, and it seems like it was sort of preordained or there was a grand plan. It's honestly, I mean, even up until the British Museum, I just apply for jobs, and if I get them, then I'm excited to give it a go and see what I can do. And I've never really had a plan. And when we both studied art history, I don't know about you, but also, it was kind of a gradual thing. I think I became more diligent during my BA. I think the first year or two I was not very diligent. I was enjoying being in London. And then with the BA, it was more about getting a good enough result to then not just do an MA, but in my case, probably yours, to get funding to do the MA, and then the same with the MA to the PhD. And then thereafter, it was about kind of survival of getting, internships or jobs that would pay the rent. And so I've never really had a grand plan, and I think that's much better, because I think if you have a very fixed idea about what you should do or what you're going to do, you're probably going to get disappointed in some way, shape or form. I think it's much better to be kind of open and see what life throws at you. And some of the things that I didn't get, the jobs I didn't get, which are many, by the way, especially the early... I'm not applying for jobs now, by the way, don't worry. But some of the things I didn't get then took me to a much better place eventually. So I think it's really important to kind of just go with the flow and see where things take you.
Yeah. I mean, I remember between your first year and your second year, you did this work experience at the Guggenheim in Venice. And I remember you being so enthusiastic about handling artworks and stuff when you got back.
When I dropped a Picasso on my foot, yeah.
Yeah. I wasn't going to say that. I mean, tell me a little bit about Italy, because that has been quite a focus. It was quite a focus of the things you studied as an undergraduate and later on.
Yeah.
And it is where you kind of went to go and do work experience and those kind of things. What was it about Italy that really captured you?
Well, yeah, we're talking like 25 years ago now, and I mean, the Courtauld then was, and I'm sure it's true of other academic institutions for art history, was a very different place. And at that point, I knew I wanted to specialize in modern and contemporary art, and I had two choices, which were basically Chris Green, early 20th century, France, pretty much, focused on Paris, or Sarah Wilson, who was my choice. Post-war, but still France. So basically kind of everything, and then you had Minor Nixon, who you studied with, who was American, but that wasn't my route. But if you wanted to focus on European art, it was basically looking at essentially Paris as the epicenter, and then maybe how that radiates out. So me looking at Italy was quite exotic and surprising, and no one was doing it at the time, so that's kind of how that began. But it was just that I wanted to, especially when it gets to choosing a PhD subject, you're trying to find something that hasn't been done to death. And so that was how that began, that I was trying to find a field that was less, maybe less mined, but also with good food and weather.
Yeah, I mean, well, the next slide, I think, is good food. I mean, during that PhD, you studied at the British School in Rome, and when we talked last week, I mean, it was clear, actually, also, when you got back from there, that had a really transformational effect on you. Yeah. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that situation.
Yeah.
And the food.
I think, I mean, this is actually very interesting in terms of what I did thereafter and even where I am now. So my PhD subject, which we might mention quickly, was arte povera, so post-war Italian art from the 1960s, but especially about how that group of artists looked towards Italy's past as a way to think about the future. So Some examples here, yeah. So looking at either the classical past or even a kind of Franciscan aesthetic, the idea of poverty. And of course, they were the first generation of post-war Italian artists to go back to classicism, which had been really tainted by fascism and was still a very fresh wound in the 1960s, or to look at other aspects of Italy's past. So in order to research it, I got a fellowship at the British School at Rome, and I was there for about 18 months researching my PhD. But what this meant was, alongside my PhD subject, which was about looking at contemporary art, basically, neo-contemporary art, but that one that looked at a range of different periods, this meant that I was working and living alongside art historians, but also contemporary artists. There would always be about 7 different artists in residence at the British School, archaeologists, classicists, you name it. And, you know, having dinner around those tables every night and talking to people about what they were doing and their discoveries and their, you know, excavations or research. And I think that really cemented my interest in making connections between the past and the present, and also between different fields and disciplines, and maybe not sticking to one cookie cutter idea of being a kind of contemporary arts specialist. And that's kind of led me to where I am today.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll just have a look at some of these other works. I mean, these were works that you talked about in your PhD and then you later acquired for Tate. What the Mertz is.
Actually, no, I think the Marisa Mertz was acquired before I got there. But I worked on a show for her that was at the Met. But yeah, I worked with all of these artists pretty much, apart from Mario Mertz, who died before I wrote his obituary, but that was as close as I got, yeah. And yeah, of course, the Pistoletto piece, yeah.
So, I mean, you kind of referenced earlier on a little bit having to sort of keep your head above water, I guess. And I don't know why you did a PhD with no funding. You sort of did it immediately without sort of waiting around to get some funding.
Yeah.
But it in many ways had a lot of quite positive effects because you had to go to the British School at Rome to kind of fund that year.
Yeah.
You had to go to New York afterwards when you were working at MoMA, and it really gave you... Am I getting a little bit of feedback off this?
No, it sounds fun to me.
There was a lot of experience that you got there that then allowed you to apply for this job at Tate and get it.
Yeah.
And the first show I think you worked on was Duchamp Man Picabia, which we're just looking at some pictures of here, which was already quite far underway when you started. And I just kind of wanted to show a little bit of the installation, just to give a sense of kind of what that show was like. I mean, it's not much like the shows that you make.
No, so this was curated by Jennifer Mundy, who was a curator at Tate, is still living, but no longer at Tate. Was a curator at Tate for many years and did some amazing shows, including the Surrealism Desire Unbound show that we saw when we were students. That's back in like 2000, I think, or 2001. Yeah. And this, in a way, was the sequel to that show, putting together, of course, the 3 artists in the title. And it was years of research, and it was a sprawling exhibition intellectually, but also in terms of the number of objects. I think it was like 400 objects. And I joined Tate in early, like February or March 2007, and this show opened in February or March of 2008. And when I joined, there was a huge amount of work to do. So it was a very, very steep learning curve to get the show ready to open, because it was colossal in every way, shape, or form. But I guess it was good discipline to learn lots of things about how to do things and how not to do certain other things. But it was an incredible exhibition. I mean, you know, fascinating. Yeah. But no, I mean, it wasn't I was the assistant curator. It wasn't my exhibition. I was there supporting and learning. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of using it as a bit of a foil for the next show that you worked on, which was the Twombly exhibition. And we're just going to watch this video, but it's silent. Okay. So maybe don't look at it, because your hair doesn't look great. This was a show that you worked on with Nicholas Sirota, an exhibition of works by Cy Twombly. I mean, really a kind of a big retrospective of his work. I mean, a show that is totally different in sensibility to Duchamp Man Picabia. I mean, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that experience of working on this show.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, this was kind of amazing. So obviously I'd spent like 18 months living in Rome at the British School from like 2004 to the end of 2005. Obviously, Cy Twombly lived in Rome for like more than 50 years. I never met him. He was this like mythical creature, like a unicorn. And when you mentioned me then, after I left Rome, I moved to New York because there was funded internships and I couldn't afford to work for free in the UK. And at the time, that was all there was on offer, basically, that you had to be able to like fund yourself to work for free, which I couldn't do. So I had to move to New York, maybe not the biggest hardship ever. But I began, as you mentioned, at MoMA in the photography department, and then I was very lucky. I got this fellowship at the Guggenheim, where you spend 3 months, where I'd been an intern before in Venice, a few years before, but you spend 3 months in New York, 3 months in Venice, 3 months in Bilbao. And obviously I did the New York stint first, and while I was there, the Guggenheim Bilbao acquired this very important, but very misunderstood and maligned series by Twombly called 9 Discourses on Commodus from the early 1960s. And they asked me to do some kind of basic curatorial research, and I began doing that, and then discovered all these interesting things about that no one had really put together around the exhibition, which had been really lambasted by Donald Judd, who was then a very important critic before becoming a big proponent of minimalism. And this had really killed Twombly's career in America for like 30 years, basically, until the early 90s. And so, for example, I went through all the archives and discovered that the way it had been installed at Leo Castelli's gallery was incorrect. They were out of sequence. Cy had never gone because he didn't like going back to America. Anyway, what that meant was that they then asked me to write the essay for they did a big collection catalogue for the Guggenheim Bilbao. And in doing that, I got in touch with Twombly. And in fact, I was with you on the steps of the Met in early 2007 when I thought I was calling his assistant, and I instead got Cy Twombly on the phone, which was a bit of a surprise. But anyway, and then what I didn't know was that when I went for the Tate job, Nick Sirota, obviously then director, was working on a show for Twombly, and they were looking for someone to kind of work with Nick on the show. So that's how I got that job, and then I began doing that. But it was wild because I was then in my late 20s, and yeah, like suddenly had to kind of go and meet Cy Twombly and be in his studio, and again we did this show in just over a year, which was really very rapid, but like an incredible. I mean, the double thing of like working with Nick Sirota, but also working with Cy Twombly as someone aged 29, it was kind of amazing. And I knew it at the time. I knew to make the most of it and appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember actually when you got the job as director of the MPG, somebody said to me, "Oh, what a shame, because he's such a brilliant curator." And there's this idea that directors don't curate.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wondered about the experience of working on this exhibition with the sort of uber director, Nicholas Sirota.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that experience? I mean, he's somebody, you can recognize a hang that Nicholas Sirota does immediately.
He's very good at that. Yeah, well, I definitely learned how to hang a show from him. I mean, for example, like you don't measure anything, you do it all by your eye, and you make sure that things are a little bit off-center so that the eye has some interest. You don't put things in the middle of a wall or like perfectly framed by the doorway, measuring the distance between. You kind of do it. I mean, back to the kind of director-curator dichotomy, you could call it. I don't know. I think if you're doing a good job as a director, you have a curatorial affinity. Mm-hmm. You don't. What I don't like to do is micromanage the curators or meddle. But it's more about curating good ideas.
Yeah.
And I would say the further you go, I feel like I'm curating so many things that I don't need to curate an exhibition. I mean, it can be nice to do that, but currently I'm too busy to kind of think about that. But I don't think of them as being different roles as such. I mean, the thing that's nice about being a director is that it's your job to champion and support everyone, and that's a very nice thing to get to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, I guess, that you were really kind of inspired in some ways by Twombly's studio practice. I mean, the exhibition doesn't give much trace of that.
The Twombly exhibition, yeah.
I mean, tell us a little bit about the kind of differences between a studio and an exhibition as different kind of contexts for looking at work.
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. Like the Twombly show, it was very pure, it was very classical, and it was very kind of clean, which is a kind of Nick aesthetic. But I think also it's kind of what Si wanted at that point. He was appropriately involved in the exhibition. The studio, I mean, it was just fantastic. Like those, from 2007 to 2011 when he died, it's like 4 years of going to see him regularly and going to see his studio regularly. And this was a moment where he was being incredibly productive. And, you know, the studio, the one before is his house in Gaeta, which was very domestic and cluttered. But this is the industrial studio he had. And these are my photos from summer of 2008. And this series eventually ended up in the Brandhorst Museum in Munich. But literally every time I would go, you would see a whole industrial complex, I mean, kind of not much smaller than this room, filled with new paintings. It was astonishing. And then what you maybe can't see so much is alongside, you can kind of see tacked up on the wall, like reference images, but there would always be a lot of other things in the studio, like notebooks, other references. So here, like a still life by Bonnard, or medieval chivalry, which he was basing it on, like all these different references. So a much less pure encounter with art. But what I would say is, and we'll get to this, the experience of being inside Twombly's studio at what turned out to be the end of his life inspired the Matisse cutout show, which we'll come on to. So it did have a big impact on me and still does. Yeah.
I mean, after the artist's death, Tate were given this...
I found those on the floor. They were yeah, it's really weird to see them in a museum. When, I think it was again like 2008, and we'd finished the show, but I went to see Si in Gaeta, where he lived on the coast of Italy between Naples and Rome. And I was in that big studio that we just saw before, and there were these 3 rolled up canvases. And I was like, Si, what are these? Like, oh, they're just some paintings never finished. So I unrolled them, and I've got photographs of unrolling them. And he was like, do you want me to finish them? And I was like, yes, please. So he did, and donated them to Tate. Sadly, he died before the donation was complete, but the foundation honoured his wishes, and they were given to Tate, and they're, I think, still now on view. It's very weird, like the difference between being in a studio, seeing works made, just it being part of normal life, and then them kind of being enshrined in a museum, even though that's what I do. It does often feel quite strange to see that trajectory.
Yeah, and Twombly was somebody that you really kind of carried on working with his work. So this show from 2011, which took place at Dulwich Picture Gallery, and it might seem quite a strange pairing of Twombly and Poussin. I mean, tell us a little bit about this.
So when we were... for the Tate show, which was 2008, we interviewed Si for the catalogue, and Si famously, I think had only done like one interview in his entire life with David Sylvester, which had been published. This was a huge thing for him to do. And in those interviews, he talked about Nicolas Poussin, the French 17th century sort of neoclassical painter, being his ultimate hero and like his favorite painter, which when you think about it, it's just bizarre because they're completely opposite. Like Si Twombly, abstract, gestural, and Poussin, this very rigorous, contained neoclassical painter. And I thought it was such an interesting idea. And around that time, Dulwich Picture Gallery, this is in 2011, were gearing up to celebrate their bicentenary, founded in 1811. And they asked if I would curate a show which would have a sort of contemporary element, but would reflect part of their history. So I thought about putting together Twombly and Poussin, which when you think about it sounds bizarre. But this is probably still my favorite show I've ever done. I thought it was really, really beautiful. Sorry, I don't like sit around like thinking like how great things I've done are, but I thought there was something really, really special about this because it was, I generally like to do things that haven't been done or are weird or sound like a bad idea. And that was all of those, but I think it really was very beautiful because what it really made you think about was there's a tendency when you pair contemporary artists with historic artists. I'm thinking of, for example, I'm going to pick on a random one. There was a show recently of the works of Caravaggio and Bacon, Francis Bacon, because they're both dark and, you know, foreboding. But it can be quite a, superficial kind of juxtaposition that, you know, they look alike. And here this was about two things that look nothing alike but have the same deep source of either mythology or the Italian landscape in the image before. And there's something I think, like quite interesting about thinking beyond appearances and this sort of source of deep inspiration that can take radically different guises 4 centuries apart.
Yeah. I mean, the show ended with a film of Twombly by Tasta Dean, who I guess was the next kind of big project that you worked on at Tate, where you worked on the turbine hall installation of this work is just called Film.
Yeah.
This is a rather different kind of context, I guess, where the curator is acting as a kind of producer of a work. I mean, what was the experience of this like?
So Tasta is wonderful. I've worked with her a few times now over my career, but this was the first project we did together. And actually, I'd met her in like late 2009 in Rome and introduced her to Twombly because Twombly was her hero. And then she kind of made that film about him that we put in the Dulwich show. But alongside doing the Dulwich show, I was curating the Turbine Hall commission that year with Tasta, which was not an obvious commission. It wasn't my idea. I was assigned the projects, which happened a lot at Tate Modern. Because at that point, you know, a lot of the Tate Modern commissions were quite spectacular, monumental, large scale, as arguably they should be. For example, like Anish Kapoor, you know, Marzies, or famously Oliver Eliasson's The Sun, the Weather Project. And so to have an artist who was, you know, better known for her use of analog film, smaller scale, quite subtle, was counterintuitive. And what the piece became was, at this point, this is, you know, 2010, 2011, there was a huge amount of discussion around how much analog film was being imperiled because essentially it was the infrastructure was being kind of run into the ground to make way for digital. And this is something that Tasta was, and still is, but it's more stable now, was incredibly concerned about. And so this piece became, which was analog film, despite the big monolith that it was projected onto, became a sort of elegy, a eulogy for film itself. Yeah. It was not easy to do, it was very complicated.
Yeah, and I guess I'm interested in how sort of involved you get into into the problems of making a work like this as a curator. I mean, an artist sort of has to solve their own problems to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of technical assistance that was needed to do this. So all of this masking is done inside the camera. So it needed to have a whole kind of new metal gate fitted inside the 16mm camera. There's a lot of, I mean, you learned an awful lot technically in that period of time. I mean, how much do you think that's the job of a curator, to learn how something's made, produced in that way?
Well, it sort of depends a little bit on what the artist needs and what they want. And also like what the, you know, now with architects, which we might touch on, it's kind of the same, you have to learn what's appropriate and what's helpful. So for example, with Lena Goetmer, who I think we'll finish with, the architect, with Jamie Forbert, who I worked with at the National Portrait Gallery, you know, we would just send images and references back and forth all the time. And what I'm learning is Lena really loves when I do that, but I have to be quite careful because I don't want to bombard someone and make someone feel micromanaged. And it's the same with artists, that you have to kind of know where things should begin and end. And I would say with this commission, I was much more in the guise of a producer, like figuring out the infrastructure, because basically, Tasta had to invent an entirely new process to do this. She moved into 35mm, having only worked in 60mm, but because of the scale. She had to buy a Steenbeck, which is the great film cutting machine, which are now very difficult to come by. And she developed all of these techniques of early cinema from the sort of, you know, early 20th century around masking, done at large scale. It was a huge experiment. It almost failed. Like, so many things went wrong. There was a moment where I remember the weekend before it opened, we didn't have a film. And I was like, who do I call first to cancel the terminal? Do I call Nick? Do I call the press office? I'm trying to think how I begin to shut this whole thing down. So it was a big experiment. And, Tast and I both, and other people, but as the artist and the curator, we really went through it with this. So it was a bit of a baptism of fire. We're still very bonded by that, I think. And you learn in that, how you can be helpful, what's appropriate, what the artist needs, what the work of art needs.
Yeah. And this work now is in the Tate collection. It's one of the few that was acquired from the Turbine Hall.
That is true, yeah.
So we'll swiftly move through the Matisse cutouts, which we have to really talk about because it's still, I think, the most visited exhibition ever at Tate. And if you ever see this stuff on a graph, it's not just like a little bit more, it's like huge amounts more. I mean, what do you think was the appeal of this? There's a little film in here as well, which is less humiliating.
So the idea for the show really did come out of the experience I mentioned of being with Cy Twombly in the studio. So the Cy Twombly show was 2008, and I proposed this show back in January of 2009. And actually, when I mentioned it to Nick Sirota at first, and I said, we should do Matisse cutouts, because at that point, Tate hadn't done a Matisse show. It had done Matisse Picasso in 2000 and 2001. But it hadn't really done anything around him. And of course, Tate has the Snail, which is one of the great cutout works. The other thing is, just personally speaking, kind of going back to your earlier point about the influence of growing up where I did, or using kind of intuition. As a teenager, do you remember those Taschen, the pack of 6 little posters you could buy? There was one of jazz, and I had them on my bedroom wall. And for me, that was like modern art. That was what modern art looked like. And I think for a lot of people that was true. And I often now, still when I do things, I try and do things really with intuition rather than focus grouping something or thinking. And I just thought, I think this would just be a really great show to do. And I think people would love it. And there's work to be done. So anyway, despite the initial skepticism, Nick then basically green-lighted me to begin the show. And it took 5 years, which it would, to kind of get those loans. It was incredibly difficult. But if you just go back one image, that's obviously the Snail. But this was really the inspiration. This is kind of what I was saying before. So you see the Snail on the walls of Tate. But what we really wanted to do with the exhibition was to give you the sense of how these were made. Because what was interesting is they were, at this point, late in life, Matisse was often bedbound, as you see here. And they were pinned up on the walls around him, changing every day, moving, migrating, not fixed compositions. They were almost like proto-installations. They're not paintings, they're not drawings, they're something else. And we really wanted in the show to kind of give people a sense of that. And we, alongside, the 5 years of getting the loans, which was incredibly difficult, we really did this massive archival research where we went to every photographer that, where there'd been a photo in life, and found all of the other photos. Or you saw in the video, we found images of him making them, which had never been seen before, had been lost in the vault. And I think this really made the show feel alive. And that's maybe why, everyone likes the cutouts, because they're joyful and colorful. But I think what really made that show sing was the new research around it. Yeah. But I think also just I think everything you do, you have to do with sincerity, even if only you think it's a good idea. If you think it's a good idea, probably some other people might also agree. And I think you have to really do everything with an eye to kind of the integrity and quality of either the research or, the kind of final output of it.
Yeah. Let's try and...
It wasn't like a cynical blockbuster, basically.
I mean, you left Tate just right at that point, right? The exhibition opened, and you took a job in New York at the Met, which we're looking at here, the modern and contemporary galleries as they are now, and probably not for much longer. Yeah. I mean, what was the appeal of going to New York, and what was the difference in institutional context?
Well, the appeal wasn't really New York. The appeal was the Met, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about wanting to, even if working within modern and contemporary art, which at that point I still was. I was, curator of modern and contemporary art. but it was in an encyclopedic context, so that was the real appeal. And the Met's an amazing museum. And at this point, there was a very exciting prospect of not just the Met becoming much more active within contemporary art, but also taking on the Breuer building, which we'll see. So that felt very exciting about, so this is the Breuer building, which was programmed by the Met for 4 years until COVID, has now just become Sotheby's, no comment. At least it's still filled with art. It's not an Apple store, so that's something,
Yeah. I mean, you did make some really interesting acquisitions, even though you were there for quite a short period of time, relatively. I mean, what's the difference between working in an American context where things happen super quickly as compared to Tate? I mean, from proposal to that thing in the gallery.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You can do things more quickly, maybe, because there's money, basically. And at that point, I was being given a lot of trust to kind of go and... So, like, for example, the film by Amy Siegel, Provenance, which the Met acquired, which is this amazing film looking at essentially the chairs designed by Genere and the way that they've migrated from Chandigarh in India, where this still is taken, which was also designed by Le Corbusier, all around the world. There's now these kind of luxury fetish, they're the chairs that you see in like art booths at Frieze, basically, that signal wealth and taste. But I saw this when it opened at a small gallery downtown, Simon Preston Gallery in New York, and basically that night I was like, I want it. And then I was able the next day to kind of say to my boss and then the trustees, we should get this. And then like we acquired it, Tate acquired it, Guggenheim acquired it, Whitney acquired it, like every museum acquired it. So that was kind of exciting to be able to do those things. But what I will say too is that American museums are also very traditional or conservative sometimes. Because of the influence that trustees have, because they're not just the trustees, they're also often the funders and donors. So you really have to kind of bring them with you on that journey of taste. And so there's something to be said for the kind of independence of British museums too, I would say.
For sure. I mean, just to signal that, this is also a kind of commitment to film that you had here by, this I think is probably the first 16mm film installation that the Met ever.
Yeah, and the Paul Sharratt's film were incredibly important. I mean, I suppose I was doing this on the back of having just done the piece with Tacita, and one thing to say is that the Turbine Hall, we produced a catalogue where, again, as a kind of paean to film as an endangered medium and analog mediums in general, we got like 100 different people to write about analog, basically. And so I had a big interest in that, and moving to the Met and trying to get the Met to become, because the Met's modern and contemporary department to that point had been like painting, basically. Nothing wrong with painting, but it was pretty much only painting. So like, let's get a Kiefer, or we're going to get a Sean Scully, or that, and that's contemporary. And we were really trying here to kind of...
you can see that in that slide.
So you've got like your Alex Katz and your late Hockney and some very... Chuck Close, very nice things, but it's a very conservative take on contemporary, and I thought it was very important to kind of challenge that and to be a bit bolder with acquisition. So, for example, it's not shown here, but the Met famously have the portrait of Lee Bowery by Lucien Freud from the back, and I remember saying rather cheekily to my then boss Tom Campbell, like, we've got Lee Bowery from the back, so we need him from the front. And so we acquired Charlie Atlas's film about Lee Bowery. So just trying to like push it a little bit, I do like pushing things.
Yes. So at the Breuer, the inaugural show actually was one that you proposed, but it's perhaps fitting that the idea was unfinished and you left it unfinished.
See, that was my conceptual...
Absolutely. So, I mean, how does that feel to kind of hand over an idea like that to another curator?
Well, so this idea actually came from Cy Twombly. I mean, he didn't say, you should do a show about unfinished works, but he talked to me about, as an artist, how he was fascinated by unfinished works because it was something he wrestled with every work he made, which kind of blew my mind, because I feel like as art historians, we're not always maybe told to think about it from the perspective of the person making it. And, we write, and when we write, there's a point where you're like, is this good enough? Is this as far as it can go? Have I done too much? And of course, it's the same for any artist. Anyone that makes something, there is this moment of, is this as far as it can go? Is this good enough? Or do I let it go into the world? Or have I done too much? So I thought that was very interesting. And then when I went to the Met, they were looking for exhibitions to program at the Breuer that would bring together lots of different departments of the Met and lots of different periods in time. And I just thought this kind of tabula rasa of unfinished works, which go back to antiquity, like the Met and the British Museum. We have unfinished Egyptian and Greco-Roman sarcophagi. And, here you've got the incredible, not so much unfinished, but like non-finito Titian, the flaying of Marsyas from the Czech Republic, which was an amazing loan, where the roughness of the painting is, you can't really tell if this was finished by Titian or if it's because of old age.
Yeah.
It was left slightly nebulous. So I thought it was a fascinating show to work on. It was a nightmare because getting the Met to work together, getting all those departments to work together was a first.
Yeah,
and it's something I'm now doing at the British Museum.
Yeah.
But it was a very steep learning curve.
Yeah.
And then I left before it was done because I basically, got this incredible offer of moving back to London and becoming director of the National Portrait Gallery. And that wasn't just about ambition. I was really, really homesick and I really missed London and I really wanted to come back. And this was my chance. I was like, I'm going to grab it because if I don't do this, I'm stuck here for another 10 years. So I just really wanted to come home, basically. And so, it's not, I have, because of moves, there have been shows, including Matisse, but I did finish the Matisse show, but I finished it at the Met, not at Tate, where you do have to kind of leave things behind. And it's difficult, but, there's always other ideas and projects too.
Yeah, so now we're at the MPG. We've got about 15 minutes.
Okay.
We're going to race through some of this. Okay. I mean, this is the work that you got the job with by Shirin Neshat. Why were you proposing this portrait?
So in the interview by the trustees for the job, one of the questions I was asked was, if you could commission a portrait of any sitter by any artist, what would it be? And this was my answer. This didn't exist, by the way. This was just an idea that we made happen. But it was very deliberate, and it was deliberate because I thought it would make a good portrait. I think it did that. Yeah. But it was also, it did two things, which is in terms of let's start with the sitter, which is the way that the National Portrait Gallery always approaches things, sitter first. I thought Malala would be, definitely deserved to have a portrait, given her contribution, the youngest Nobel Prize winner in the world. Someone, who wasn't born in the UK, but was now and still is living there. And so I felt like she would be like an inspirational figure for lots of people and make lots of people feel seen or represented or included. And then the choice of artist was very deliberate. So Shirin Neshat is an incredible Iranian artist, but has been based in America since the revolution, basically, and is famous for her black and white photographs of subjects, but often with calligraphic impressions, which you see here, So she did the same thing with Malala, this Pashto poem. So this was an idea, and the reason for Shirin was, I didn't want to say, okay, let's have Malala, but we'll find a British figurative painter to do that. And there's, again, nothing wrong with British figurative painters, but at that point, that's kind of all the National Portrait Gallery was doing. Yeah. And again, I wanted to push it and really make this about excellence, and that you find the artist from wherever they are, in the world, that's the right artist to do that portrait. And also just thinking back that, the National Portrait Gallery has Holbein and has Van Dyck and has many non-British artists that are now part of the canon. So I thought this was a way to kind of, again, just open things up, and we made it happen, which was great.
Yeah. So talking about directors curating, this was the exhibition that you talked about for, years, like a decade's worth of you talking about having this exhibition about Michael Jackson, which I don't think we ever thought would happen. And then you became the director of a museum, and it did. Maybe I'll just...
I had to become the director of a museum to get to do it,
so maybe just talk a little bit about this show, and I'll flick through some images.
So this might be one of the exhibitions that you think is a bad idea.
No.
But I'm still really proud of this show because it was very risky, but it was also very innovative, and it wasn't a dumb show. So basically, so look, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, I grew up with Michael Jackson. I'm not going to say touch me as a child, because that's, you don't want to go there. But, you know, he was a big, for better or for worse, he was a big influence on me personally and my generation. And this wasn't a hagiography. It wasn't sort of just talking about what a wonderful singer and dancer he was. It was thinking about him as a cultural figure and all of the issues, good and bad, that he raises. And one thing that's very interesting is that, you know, of any subject of the last 150 years, he is the most depicted by incredible artists, starting with Andy Warhol, going through, this is...
Faith Ringgold. And
Faith Ringgold.
This is one of the first times Faith Ringgold's work was shown in the UK in decades.
Amazing, yeah.
And then had, you know, a million shows of her work after this.
No, I remember her coming for the opening. You know, we had like, I can't remember, it must have been like 30 or 40 incredible artists, many of them living. If we just go back, like super famous but less famous, Dawn Mellor. These are her teenage, sorry, if you just go back one. These are her teenage like fan drawings of Michael Jackson from the 80s. If you go back and get Kehinde Wiley, this is this wild, incredibly kitsch equestrian portrait that Michael Jackson actually commissioned right before he died by Kehinde Wiley. He wanted to be shown as a kind of like Rubens, equestrian, Velázquez portrait, and he never actually got to see this finished. It was wild, and you know, I commissioned Zadie Smith to write an essay for the catalogue that's just an incredible piece of writing, like what Michael Jackson's face means to her and many other people of colour. And it was also a way, at this point, this is in 2018, you know, the National Portrait Gallery was seen as being very stuffy and staid and not relevant or interesting. And there's times where you need to do things that will get people talking if you want your institution to thrive and to live. And there's moments where you have to like shake things up, and you know you're shaking it up, but you're doing it purposefully. But again, this wasn't like a cynical, dumb thing that I was doing just to get people talking. The artists like Jordan Wolfson, incredible. Like it was, and it made the gallery so much more contemporary. I will say too that when we look back in 2020, when the summer of 2020, when lots of museums were rightly being asked about what they'd done in terms of working with artists of colour after the murder of George Floyd, this show like saved our skin. Because I think without the show, it would have looked incredibly bad, and just the number of artists of colour that were in the show, you mentioned Faith Ringgold, but many, many more, it really had an important impact.
Maybe if we just talk a little bit about this portrait of yourself, and then we'll leave it there.
Okay, well, I mean, it was part of a show. So this is by Elizabeth Payton, who, if we just go back one image, sorry, we did I think probably one of my favourite shows at the MPG, the time I was there, an exhibition for her, which was very beautiful because it was putting her work in dialogue, as you see here. This is her portrait of Liam Gallagher with historic portraits. And as part of that, I sat for her, and I mean, she's a friend. There's actually just another portrait that she's done of me, which is my official portrait for the National Portrait Gallery, because every director gets a portrait, so I asked Elizabeth to do it. I'm not wearing shorts this time. I actually didn't know, actually this is so funny, because we did the portrait, the sitting, it was a really hot day, and I wore shorts because I thought it would be 3/4. I didn't think the shorts would make it into the painting. And I was slightly horrified but it works, it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we actually have run out of time. And that's okay, because we would move on to the British Museum and lots of things that you get asked about all the time, which is what I wanted to kind of, have a conversation about some things that...
We'll stop short.
Yeah. So, Helen. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So I feel like there's this idea of art galleries and museums that is very quiet and calm, and someone like drops something and you're like, why are you making noise?
Yeah.
But I mean, as an archaeologist, I feel like there is a push for history museums towards more interactive exhibits. And engaging, you want more liveliness, you want more sound. So do you think that that style of quiet for art museums? Is that going anywhere? Should that change? Is that good?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you want to give people and audiences options. And sometimes I think museums do need to become places of more community or more gregarious. They need to be brought to life. Like, I mean, the Michael Jackson show, you know, there was music in the show, which was very unusual for a National Portrait Gallery show. The other thing is that sometimes people come to museums to get away from all of those things, and not in a kind of rarefied way, but even people just like a digital detox where they don't have their phone with them and they could just commune with an object or a space. Or so I think, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of like lots of bells and whistles next to art or objects, because I think it can really take away people's options and the chance to kind of decide what they want. And I'm not saying that in a kind of purist way that you know, these are reverent spaces. I think, but I would almost prefer that someone is able to listen to music on their headphones, which I do a lot in galleries, by the way. So yeah, I think it's the key thing is to make people feel at ease and to give people choices in those spaces depending on what they're looking for or what they need. And there isn't just one way to be in a museum. There's many, many different ways to be. But sometimes, I mean, I kind of agree with what I think you're saying, which is you have to break some of that sense of this is a very rarefied space and you can only, I think it's important to disrupt that, but I think you need to let people figure out how they want to disrupt it.
Okay, there was another question just there, and then I think we're actually going to have to
Sorry, okay.
no, because I didn't know we were supposed to be
I wonder, I don't know, can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah. I'll tell you when you've asked the question.
Well, firstly, I was surprised when I see you holding this old vase because I have you connected to modern art. So I would be very interested why you decided to be immortalized with this particular piece of art.
Oh, the Portland vase.
Secondly,
yeah.
What is your house like? Is it full of modern things? Is it minimalist?
He lives in the museum. He literally lives in the museum.
I'll take so the Portland vase. It was just, well, we didn't want to do the usual museum director, arms folded. It's just such a.
You could have had something modern. You could have had glass.
Well, so the Portland vase, again, that was my interview question for the British Museum. So the finalists had to present an object, and I chose that. And I chose it because, not because I wanted to kind of rarefy Roman art, but because it was something that was shattered into like 1,000 pieces in the 19th century. And I was talking about repair, because obviously at that point, the museum was going through a process of repair. I think we all know what happened. So it was a kind of metaphor for how you piece something back together again and make something good from something that has been damaged.
What's your house like?
What's the, I mean...
Not the one in World of Interiors, which we can all see.
It's, well, there's lots of books, and I mean, I don't really collect art, but there are some things, but so there's some contemporary things, but there's older things. I've got quite eclectic tastes. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's say thank you.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you.
Only a few minutes, don't worry. My name is Helena Cox and I'm the University Art Curator, overseeing a collection of over 900 artworks of very modern art here on campus, and I just want to express our thanks and gratitude for this wonderful, wonderful evening. Mainly, I would love to express our really deepest gratitude to Dr. Nicholas Cullinan OBE for such an inspiring, insightful event and a real insight into curating modern art today, and to his best buddy, Dr. James Boaden, for framing this event through such thoughtful prompts and questions. And obviously James is from our history of our department, so we're so lucky to have such wonderful people working at the university. It was really heartwarming to see the role that Yorkshire, the Yorkshire roots, played in Nicholas's career. I thought that was really quite uplifting, and also how international his career became, starting from Hebden Bridge. The conversation was also a really touching testament to the lasting friendships formed at universities, and I do hope that all the students here will take inspiration from this. And how wonderful to hear from Nicholas about so many different facets of the role of a curator, which obviously is the best job in the world. And my personal new next goal is to get a portrait of myself painted in my shorts. This wonderful, uplifting event would not be possible without the generosity of Professor Brian Cantor, a former VC of the university, who not only supports this amazing lecture series, but also together with his wife, Jill Partridge, very kindly loaned a collection of modern and contemporary art into our university art collection. And we are very lucky to have both of them with us today. Thank you so much, Brian, for this amazing honor. And it is also thanks to Professor Cantor that we have this wonderful catalogue of our art collection, upside down, which was published in 2015. The catalogue enables us to share treasures from our collection with students, staff, and the public alike, and to spread the word about our artwork nationally and internationally. And in fact, we will be sending a copy of this catalogue with Nicholas today to wherever his future career takes him. Last but not least, I would like to express sincere thanks to Professor Michael White, current head of the History of Art Department, and to Mary Hayworth and her wonderful colleagues from the Philanthropic Partnerships team, namely Ellen and Naomi, here today as well, and to the York Events team, who worked very hard behind the scenes to make tonight's wonderful event possible. Most importantly, though, I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. It's absolutely wonderful to see so many students, staff, and members of the public alike, and also representations of the various different local communities from York and Yorkshire coming today. And this is a true and beautiful testimony to our institutional motto, to be the university for public good. Once again, our heartfelt thanks to Nicholas and James, and have a wonderful evening, one and all, and please do come again to our wonderful campus. Thank you so much.